Shabbat Shalom, everybody. So the story begins in 1994, a very long time ago, but that was actually the year that I became music director at CBST. And believe it or not, Sam was 4 years old, and I was the music director of CBST. So, okay, here we go. He was alive. So that very year, I had the privilege of having a sabbatical from HUC that I got to spend one semester in Israel. And during that semester, I had the privilege of working with Dr. Eliyahu Schleifer, who is one of the most respected and just most amazing musicologists in the world. And I used to work with him every day. We worked with the cantorial and rabbinic students very closely, and we created all sorts of amazing projects together. Over the semester that I was there, he received a phone call from Rabbi John Levy, who was the rabbi at a huge synagogue in Melbourne, how you pronounce it, Melbourne, Australia. So the rabbi called and asked Dr. Schleifer, who knows everything about German synagogue music, and he said, I have a problem. I've discovered these cylinders, these old recordings that the music director at my synagogue for many years here in Melbourne must have brought over. He placed in an attic when he came, and they've sat there for many years, and he died. And they've come to us, and we don't know what to do with them, and we're not sure what their origin is. We will fly you over and see what you can do to help us with this mystery. So he did go over, and the rest is kind of history, which we're just delighted to talk about tonight. It turns out that these recordings are probably the only recordings of voices, the actual voices of people singing in between 1928 and 1932 when they were made. It's a miracle. So let me just tell you a little bit about these recordings and what was the purpose. So the idea was that they would record all of their music for the entire liturgical year because, the gramophone was brand new, and they were a cutting-edge synagogue, and they wanted to show that they had the capacity to do this. But also, they wanted to share the particular kind of music that they did, which included hiring a 100-voice choir and using the foremost Jewish opera singers from throughout Europe to be the soloists. And what would they do with these recordings? They would send them to all of the smaller congregations throughout Germany so that they could play them on their gramophone and have great music, because nobody else could afford this. It was all funded. So it was this amazing undertaking that took 4 years, and they recorded music, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pieces of music. And they were played, and Sam is going to talk a little bit about how long they were even played. The music director of the big Reform Synagogue in Berlin was the one who pulled this all together. It was sponsored by them. Much of the music is in Hebrew, but more of it is in German, as one could imagine of the Reform community at that time, which was very much an assimilated community in many ways. These were leading politicians, musicians, scientists of the Berlin community, and they wanted a service which had a lot of German in it, had a lot of classical music in it, and they could feel a lot of pride and feel very different from their more orthodox neighbors. So Dr. Hermann Schildberger was the music director, and he escaped in 1939, narrowly escaped, and it turns out that he took these with him at that time. He moved to Australia, and nobody ever thought about him again. No one ever, most of the people on this recording, I've been told, were killed in the next 10 years, and the recordings just sat in the attic until 1994. And they were reproduced, they were edited, they were cleaned up, and we are going to have the privilege of hearing some excerpts from that tonight. So we will begin. Our first excerpt is the Deutsche Kedusha. So I don't know if this is familiar to any of you, but the Deutsche Kedusha is still the Kedusha that is sung in several synagogues in the United States to this day. Baltimore Hebrew Congregation, and there's many, many others that are of German descent, and they've kept this. So the liturgy is all in German. The responses are in Hebrew, and you will recognize the responses. This is written by the great Lewandowski. So Jason, take it away. Anybody recognize the soloist's voice? If anybody that's an opera or leader lover, that was Joseph Schmidt, the great Joseph Schmidt, the most brilliant German tenor. So, please.
Thank you. And I'll just give a little more history of these recordings. As Joyce was saying, they were produced between 1928 and 1932. So we wanted to really just focus on the fact that this is over 90 years ago that these were created. And as Joyce said, the excitement for the technology is what sort of inspired Hans Lachmann Maas, who was a distinguished publisher and an active leader of the Berlin Reform community, to actually sponsor this project himself. And his intent, as Joyce said, was for it to be used throughout Germany in different areas to enhance the services. And you can hear the pride in the music, in the German music tradition. And Joyce and I were always also talking about how radical these groups were. You know, on the outside, you know, it's not as if they were, you know, living apart and like ascetics. No, they were part of the community, but it was radical for the time, considering themselves to be fully German, shunning the ideas of Jewish day schools, and even holding their Shabbat services on Sundays. So,
Oh, yeah.
definitely.
And there's still some.
Yeah.
And there's still some synagogues in the U.S. who still, I don't know if you know about that, but I know in St. Louis there's a synagogue, a big synagogue that has services on Sundays. It's not uncommon. It's not unheard of. I see some heads nodding. Yeah.
And in addition, they were some of the first to change the pronunciation to the Sephardi pronunciation, which we heard tonight. So as you know, many to this day Ashkenazi communities use the Ashkenazi pronunciation, but they were really, you know, searching for that sort of refined, in their minds, this was more of an authentic pronunciation. So they were willing to go out on the limb and change the way that the words were said. And another thing we wanted to emphasize is that on this CD, on the 2 CDs, that there are like at least 20 tracks on both. I mean, there are many, many tracks on both CDs, and it's not just Lewandowski and other German Jewish composers, but also Beethoven, Bach, Schubert, Bruckner, and others. They all in the same project. It wasn't a separate project, and intended for synagogue use. And we also, you know, there's a booklet that comes with the CDs that taught us, you know, taught me, I guess, most of these things. I feel like there's sort of a passing of this story in a way. And we know that they were used in London at the Second Conference of the World Union for Progressive Judaism on a Friday night, in July of 1930. So, you know, what we've just heard was heard by them, and we were also talking about how much we see of ourselves in them and their choices. And even after their synagogue was burned, they continued using these recordings until 1942, until the very end.
The next excerpt we'd like to share with you is called Aus der Tiefe. I think you'll recognize it. It's German. It's in German, and yeah, you'll recognize it. But it was the original Aramaic words were not used, and instead it was a translation to the vernacular. And the soloist is the great baritone Friedrich Lechner, and who was very well known in Germany and actually had a second career after he fled Germany, and he came to New York City, and he was the cantor of Central Synagogue for many years. Made lots of recordings and sang at the Metropolitan Opera as well. Wow. And you hear that organ, that gorgeous, huge pipe organ. What a thrill to share this with you all. These recordings are truly precious artifacts of Jewish history and really allow us to connect ourselves in today. Who could imagine? How could they have imagined that nearly 100 years later, we would be sitting together and connecting to them in this very profound way, hearing their actual voices. It's mind-blowing to me. And it's really a privilege to get have a glimpse in such a way into what tefillah must have been like for this synagogue and for the German Reform community back then, not so many years ago, but such a different time, and not such a different time. We're going to conclude tonight by hearing Joseph Schmidt again singing with the choir the conclusion of the Ni'ilah service for Yom Kippur, the Shema Yisrael. Thank you, Jason. A blessing, and will continue to be a blessing to all of us. Shabbat Shalom.